A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 15. That night, the atmosphere in our house was thick with all of the things that we weren't saying to each other. Dinner came and went with barely a word spoken between us. What little conversation we had was shallow and useless, as we all danced around the topic that was on all of our minds. I remember playing with my food, poking at it with my fork as I considered just how alone I was. Lucy and I hadn't exactly fought together in this battle, but there was comfort in knowing that I wasn't the only one struggling. Just knowing that someone in the house believed me meant a lot. All night, I toyed with the idea of talking to my parents, not blurting out my fears, but actually telling them what I'd experienced. I wanted so badly to do it, but no matter how much I wanted those words to leave my mouth, they wouldn't. I don't know why. At one point, my father asked me, "Are you okay, buddy?" I looked up at him, at first not even processing the question that was asked or how I should answer. My mind had been so far away from that table that hearing a real person speak had come as a shock. "You're not eating," my father pointed out. I looked at my plate, which was still full of food, now pushed into a pile on one side of the dish. I forced myself to take a bite, chew, and swallow. "I'm just thinking," I told my father. "Well, eat up," my mother ordered. The most ordinary of conversations, and yet it felt surreal to me. It seemed wrong in the context of everything else. There wasn't much more conversation that night. We finished dinner and I helped with the dishes. We all moved through the process of cleaning the kitchen with everyone doing our part, dancing around each other in the familiar patterns that had been established over the course of my entire lifetime. All of us together, working as one well-oiled machine, and yet still at a distance from each other. Then there was the quiet time after dinner, with the TV on and none of us paying it any attention. After that, and after staying up for as late as I could push my parents to allow, I said goodnight and went upstairs. Clothes changed, teeth brushed, back to my bedroom. I walked to the window and looked out, checking to see what was out there, but not expecting to see anyone. It could never be as easy as just looking and seeing. The intruders always had to come at me from their own angle when it was the most wrong for them to be there. There was movement in the reflection of my room in the window, which startled me. I jumped and turned around and found my father standing in the doorway. "Everything okay?" he asked me. It wasn't okay. It was anything but okay. I knew what the night would have in store for me, and I was scared. Still, I forced myself to look as comfortable as possible, and I told my father that I was fine. He sat down on the bed, looking at his own hands as he said, "We had a pretty big scare this morning, huh?" I shrugged. He went on, "It would be normal for you to be a little worried." I took a step closer and asked, "About what?" My eyes were locked on him, but he was still looking at his hands. I waited for his response to that question in an almost petty way. I wanted to hear him tell me what it was okay for me to be scared of. Unfortunately, I didn't get what I wanted. He evaded the answer by saying, "About anything. You can tell me anything." I felt angry again. I wasn't normally an angry person, but I'd been feeling it come on in waves for days, and I felt it again in that moment. Tell him anything? I'd tried telling him, and what did I get in response? My parents talking about me behind my back, as though I were crazy. Did he expect me to do that again? It was such a strange conflict of emotions. On the one hand, I wanted him to get out of my room and leave me to deal with my tormentors on my own. On the other hand, I just wanted him to be my dad and hold me close and keep me safe. I don't know what was going through his head that night, and I won't begin to speculate now. I just know that I was a scared little boy, and I felt like I had nobody in the world on my side. After some time, my father stood up and looked around my room. He offered to sleep in there with me, but I said no. So he hugged me, and we said goodnight, and then he left. I closed my door behind him, and then I just stood in the middle of my room with no idea what to do next. I saw the blanket on the chair and wondered if I should put it back on the bed. It hadn't helped before, it wouldn't help now. I knew that, but at the same time it felt wrong to leave it off. So I put it back on my bed. Why not? It wasn't enough. I still felt exposed and vulnerable. I wanted to put on every sock, sweater, and jacket that I had because the thought of any exposed skin gave me the creeps. Yet what would my parents say if they came into my room to check on me and found me bundled up under a heavy blanket wearing layers of clothes in the middle of summer? I didn't know which way to turn. I didn't know if I had to be more concerned about the intruders coming into my room or my parents thinking that I was crazy. I didn't know if I should sleep in my bed or on the floor in my closet. So I stood, frozen by indecision for minutes, crying like a baby because I didn't know what to do. Then I remembered the old tape recorder buried somewhere in the back of my closet. The moment I thought of it, I went for it. The relief of having some action to take was unbelievable. It was like I could breathe for the first time since I'd gone into my room that night. I had to be quiet as I dug through my closet. I had to move softly and keep things from crashing down around me, or else my parents would come back into the room, and they would undoubtedly want to know why I was planning to record myself sleeping that night. It took me a few minutes of digging, but I found the recorder and powered it on. The batteries still worked, which was a relief. There was also tape in the recorder, but if I wanted to record that night, I would have to tape over the recording of myself reading the news as Darth Vader. It was a tough call, but I did it for the greater good. Once I closed the closet door, I went to my nightstand and set down the recorder. It wasn't recording yet, but I still felt as though I was more in control of the situation, because I was finally doing something about it. If the intruders came back, I would get proof. My parents wouldn't be able to deny real evidence. They would have to believe me, and I wouldn't have to deal with this alone anymore. I stared at the recorder, thinking. Once I pressed the button to start recording, a little red light would come on. It would be visible to anyone who came into my room in the dark. Then I started to think that if the intruders saw the recorder, they might not make their normal noises. I had to hide the recorder, but I needed it to be somewhere where it would still capture the sound clearly, so I couldn't hide it under my pillow or anything like that. Even putting it under the covers with me would muffle the sound, and I needed it to be clear. I was going to get up and look for the perfect spot, but I started to wonder if the intruders were already watching me. Maybe they were always watching me, or maybe they were just outside my room waiting for me to turn off the lights. Every thought or decision that I made was second-guessed because I had no idea how this was supposed to happen, and I needed for it to work. I needed help. After a while, I decided to keep the recorder on my nightstand, but I buried it beneath books and papers that had been sitting on the nightstand for days. If anyone glanced at the nightstand, it would look very much as it always had, and the light of the recorder would be covered. I had a plan, and I thought that it stood a good chance of working. I was almost eager for my nightly torment to begin that night, because I wanted to shove it back into the faces of the intruders and make them pay once and for all. The tape recorder had a setting on it, which would start recording when the microphone picked up a sound. This way, the tape wouldn't run out before anything happened. After some consideration, I turned on this feature, hit the record button, and hid the device on my nightstand. Then I turned off my light and stood by the switch, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I looked across the room and once again saw my own dark reflection in the mirror. It was barely visible, with just hints of an outline being highlighted by moonlight. Its face was pure black, and even though I knew what this reflection was, it still creeped me out. Once my eyes were fully adjusted to the dark, I climbed into bed and pulled the cover up to my chest. I glanced at the nightstand, confirming that the recorder's light wasn't visible in the darkness of my room, and then I put my head down on my pillow. I pulled the cover over my head. For whatever reason, I still felt as though this would protect me from any real harm. If they couldn't see that I was awake, they would have their fun and leave me alone, the same as they had done every other night. I could hear the low voices of my parents having a conversation across the hall. I couldn't make out their words, but at least I was aware of them. Once they went to sleep and the house was dark and quiet, I would feel as though my room were drifting through the cold blackness of space. I would feel even more alone than I felt during the day. While I was now familiar with the routine, I was no more comfortable with it now than I had been at the start. I hated the darkness. I hated how hot it was under my blanket. I'd only been under it for a few minutes and I was already beginning to sweat. I hated everything about my life in those days, but I knew that I just had to get to the other side of what was happening to me. Once I got past the hardest part, it would get easier. I had no reason to believe that it would get easier, but I also had no choice. The only other option was to give up, and I wasn't even sure what that would mean. Would I just fade away into the shadows and darkness? I fell asleep, listening to the sound of my parents talking. I don't know how much time passed, but I was eventually woken by the sound of a loud gasp beside my ear. My eyes shot open. My head wasn't covered anymore. I must have gotten too hot and pulled my head from beneath my blanket as I slept. If they were in my room, they knew that I was awake now. I closed my eyes, trying to be as casual as possible. I was trying to act as though I didn't even know they were there. I was just turning over and going back to sleep as I had always done. I turned on my side and pulled the sheet over my head. It was too short, so the action caused the sheet to pull up too far, leaving my feet exposed to the cool night air. The cool night air, I thought, and I suddenly realized that the blanket was no longer on my bed. My sheet was the only thing separating me from whatever was in my room. The whispers started, still so faint that I could barely make out any sounds at all, until those two words started to stand out once again. Tap, tap. Tap, tap. The words were spoken quickly and quietly, in what sounded like two different voices. They were mixed in with the sounds of the whispers, so I knew that those weren't the only words being spoken. They were just the only words that I could hear. It seemed as though there were two people arguing at the foot of my bed, quietly, as though they didn't want to wake me. But they'd already woken me. Even though I'd tried to pretend that I had just rolled over and went back to sleep, they had to know that I was awake. They were taunting me. Tap, tap, one of them said, and the whispers continued. My feet felt almost cold in contrast to the rest of my body. Though I was only covered by a sheet now, my breath was hot against my face and making the rest of me feel hot as well. All except my feet, sockless and exposed. Tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to silently pray. My parents had never made me say my prayers before bed, or go to church for that matter, so praying wasn't something that I usually did. In that moment, however, I couldn't help it. I was praying for God to protect me, praying that the recorder was working, praying that the intruders hadn't noticed my feet. In that moment, I remembered the sound of Lucy screaming. The memory of it filled my head, and my mind began to conjure up images of all the horrible things that she could have seen or experienced. It was just in my mind, but it made me even more scared. Tap, came a whisper. Tap. This time I felt it. A small, gentle tap on the bottom of my foot. Tap, tap. It happened again. It was so soft that I could barely feel it, but it was there. The intruders were no longer just noise in the dark. Tap, tap. Like the beating of a heart. Tap, tap. Over and over again. It went on all night.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.